Well, good evening to you. It's Professor Jen. It's Wednesday night of spring break 2025. Enjoying myself, keeping my thoughts together. Anyway, we're going into some new subjects, very, very exciting. I've had such a wonderful time with all the readings for this class, all the assignments, enjoying the chat, doing these coffee table series for you, our little round table chats, discussions. Of course, thank you to Captioning Services. Everything you do for us is just magnificent. Bridges all of our worlds together at once in the same time, same place. And so tonight I want to talk to you, share with you some ideas, observations about the news, how it is that we used to get the news, how news has changed with regard to pop culture, fads, trends, what seems to have stayed, what seems to have left, etc. I did some comparison today online with other cultures and customs, and I just wanted to share with you some new ideas that I put together for us. There was a time when I was in college in the 80s, feels like a long time ago. In some ways it is, some ways it isn't. In the 80s. And this is how it really was. I remember I would go for weeks not knowing what was on the news. You have to remember we had no internet in the 1980s. We had no cell phones. Many of us in dorms had no television. I went to SUNY Oswego for quite a bit of my time. I went to SUNY Brockport. In the dorms, we really didn't have any television. And in fact, now that I think back, we didn't even have cable. And of course, there was no satellite television. So if we got the news, it was really based on the radio. So many of us would listen to the radio. Remember, we didn't have streaming services. Back then, people had, a Walkman, a little machine that had little cassette tapes. So we relied on the news, you see, but it was sort of a social thing because the news came on at the top of the hour, meaning, 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m. The top of the hour, meaning both hands were on the 12. That's what the top of the hour meant. And we would hear the news, major news, national news would go on from like 8 o'clock in the morning, and then a noontime news, and then there was a 6 o'clock news, and then there was an 11 p.m. news. And this is really how media operated. This is how television functioned. And then all of the other shows, right, for entertainment, etc., for information, travel log, whatever. We had MTV music videos. All these other shows would go on really secondary around all of these news hour shows that were very important, either, on the radio or on television. And so when there was big news, it was very sociable because all of us would get together like in a common area in the dorm and we would watch the news together. Because remember, there was no way to tape the news. There was no way to stream news 24/7. So when the news came on, like people had to stop what they were doing, readjust their lifestyles, etc., and sit or stand in a congregate setting to have the news. So I was thinking, 1930s, 1940s in this country, people went and listened to the radio, right? They sat around the radio. There's all these vintage pictures, just like this little picture I have up tonight. Vintage, a young boy on a bicycle with his dog delivering newspapers. Vintage, very Americana. But you don't see it often anymore. Back to the news. So people 1930s, 1940s, maybe they waited for the paper boy, the paper girl, paper person. They would bring maybe a morning paper, right? Because like today, when we wake up, so many of us, the first thing we do is we grab the phone to see the news. Well, people relied on the newspaper. And then there was always like sometimes an afternoon edition of the newspaper, and there was an evening edition of the newspaper. So in very large cities, you could get news again 3 times a day from a large newspaper, a large source outlet. But back in the 1930s, again, like I said, people would be in congregate setting and they listened to radio program. It wasn't like they were out playing, doing other things, had a phone in their hand, had streaming services in their hand, riding the bike, a volleyball game, soccer game. People weren't doing these things. They were either at home around the radio or, or they weren't getting the news, or they'd have to wait for the news later, or they were sitting in their home waiting for the newspaper, or they would just have to read the paper later or rely on somebody else to tell them. Things have changed so much in pop culture because really I can get the news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including holidays, not only of my region, not only in my state, not only in other states, not only across the country, but I can get news from all around the world, providing that they have news service that has outgoing information. There are so many countries, we don't think of it very often, but there are so many countries that we really just can't get a lot of news unless we know somebody, say Cuba. I talk about parts of Africanus, Somali, Bulgaria. There are parts of the world that really covet and keep exclusive their news. There are other parts in the world you can get all kinds of news. 24 hours a day, you can find out exactly what's happening. And in fact, I was saying to somebody the other day, another person my age, my generation, I was saying it's so interesting because it used to be, say, if I wanted to know something about Israel, Greece, Turkey, Spain, I had to really rely on other news services, maybe where I didn't know the language or I knew somebody to tell me, etc. Or the news I would get, say, on television when I was younger, on specific stations that you can only get through cable. But today you can get news from all kinds of places that tell you exactly what's going on. There are these shows I watch on YouTube, and there are all these travel shows and people that do all of this very rogue uh, travel channels where they tell you all about the anthropological issues in different cities, states, you see, and they're able to tape video, show you everything, get all kinds of journalistic access that maybe we didn't have before. And so many places really for me in my life, as it relates to pop culture, has really come alive. Like I know an awful lot about Appalachia, and I don't seem to go there, but I watch a fair amount of people who do all these travel logs that show you all of the restaurants. They take you to the museums. They talk to local people, especially in this last election. This is not a political discussion, but just in the last election, as an example, there were all these YouTubers that would go up and down Appalachia, which extends, from tip of New York State, like Binghamton over there, and it goes all the way down to the tip of Florida. So Appalachia really goes through a very, very large part of our country. And they would interview people, discussing who they were going to vote for, what the topics seemed to have been, and what the areas of interest or need for change they felt. And so we're able to get news and events, activities that we didn't get before. Another aspect of pop culture was when people started to talk about online learning. A long time ago, we didn't have the words online learning. We had correspondent learning. That was weird, right? And I remember it meant that usually at Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you had to go to the post office and have it time stamped with all of your work in the envelope. You would send it with a cover letter to the college, etc. And then that's how you would correspond. It was considered a correspondence course. That was part of pop culture at the time. They said it was a new age, a new way of doing things where you didn't have to sit in the seat. You didn't have to be in a traditional setting or traditional construct, conservative construct. You could be doing other things, sitting on the beach in Miami, wherever you wanted to be, and take this correspondence class through college. Then we started having the conference calls. That was a very 80s thing where people were able to have these commercial type phones in their homes and have conference calls so people would have dialogue. But of course, back then we didn't have all these phone plans, so you had to pay an awful lot of money per minute to be able to talk long distance with other people. So it could be very pricey. But it was really part of pop culture because it gave people access. Then, of course, we had this online learning, right, which you're participating. And I remember even at RIT, maybe 12 years ago, 2011 seemed to be my year I started with online learning. Everybody said, oh, this is a fad. It'll never last. Why would you waste a career on this? Well, hello, friends. How are you? Let me, as Judge Judy says, let me introduce you to the truth. Here we are, 2025. We have online lives, right? And it wasn't a fad. It just it took off because it's practical, right? It's portable. It's sort of like the news. You can log on really anytime because, we're not synchronous, we're asynchronous. And you can do your thing. You can do your readings. You have complete access, etc. And go about your life wherever it is you'd like to be while you're here with me. And so, things have really changed. When we look at this in this context, it used to be that we would have to go to the record store. I know this, I must sound like very old. We used to have to go to the record store and you would hear a song and you'd say, I want to buy the record. So you'd have to buy this whole record and you'd have to have this record player to play it on. It was like a very expensive endeavor. And you had to wait for it. If the record was sold out, you were, on a waiting list that, of course, there were no computers. So you had to keep calling the record store, dropping in. We had a much different lifestyle. We had like a foot traffic lifestyle to go get the paper. People maybe paid for subscription if they could afford it in cities, but it was a sociable thing. We'd all go out, we get the newspaper, you'd see people, you'd walk your dog, you knew your neighbors. Today it's not so sociable. We're in the house. Like look at all the shopping we do. In pop culture, we said, oh, this is a trend. This is a trend that won't hang around long. Well, go tell the shopping malls that. The shopping malls are all closing in so many regions because we just don't have the foot traffic. Today with the news, again, we don't have the living room traffic. Everybody isn't piled in some place together at the same time to capture the news. I was thinking to myself how competitive everything became in the world of the news because really what is the job of the news? The news is there as a machine to bring us the most up-to-date news the fastest, right? No, not always the most accurate, but the quickest method in delivering the newest stories, right? And so that machine goes on 24 hours, 7 days a week. I noticed so many of these news media outlets regionally here, they'll tell part of the story online. Think about this. Tell part of the story online at 4 o'clock. Then they'll end the story with, we'll see you at 5 when we have more details. So right there is part of pop culture, part of contemporary culture. They want to lock you in. Like, we know the story, we have the story. We want to tell it to you first. This seems to be very important, breaking the news. We want to tell it to you first. But we don't really have any details, but we want to tell you that we want to tell it to you first. Really, it's sort of humorous when you think of it in these terms. But this is sort of what's happened. I sometimes think to myself, I used to see my own kids, they're in their 30s. I would see my kids, my older kids, and they would be, down at the Pizza Hut. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, Pizza Hut. And so they would walk down the street. At the time we lived in Brockport, it was sort of like a little village, had sidewalks. And they get all the news, who was going out with who, hanging out, talking to one another, laughing. There were no cell phones, talking, laughing. And the rule was you need to be home before the street lights came on. My daughter, Tabitha, she's 5 years older than my son TJ. And so she was sort of in charge. So she would be kind and she would take him down. She was like 13, 14 years old. I'd give her money for both of them. And of course, he liked to hang out with all the older girls at the Pizza Hut and play the video games and have the pizza buffet. So it wasn't really like she had to twist his arm to go. And this is how they got news. They got news about who was going out, who was going to Disney, who was going on vacation, who was going to the movie theater. The movie theater, hello, movie theater, for 100, please. right? It sounds like something antiquated. We used to go to movie theaters, right? We would go. This is how I remember the world. We would go and we would stand online to buy tickets. Of course, that was sociable because we saw all these other people we knew, right? If you went to a movie theater in town, you'd see everybody else. When I was in high school, I lived in Florida. And when a movie came out, like I'm thinking the Jason Takes Manhattan series, Jason, Halloween, uh, some other films would come out, and we would see everybody from the same high school we went to, and they would be on the same line. It was sociable. We would talk to one another. We would compare notes about people, classes, homework, etc., issues around Miami Beach, things that happened, uh, potential concerts that were coming to hotels, things of that nature. And it was a very social experience. Today, it's not a social experience. I can watch any movie I like that I can get access to. I can get access to thousands of movies, whether it's on my phone, the laptop, etc., my television, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Some I have to pay for, some I don't have to. If I can't sleep, I can watch the movie, anything I'd like to download, stream. And then if I'm tired of it or I get exhausted or I'm bored, I can pause it and watch it another day. We didn't have all this. We just didn't have all this 24/7, 7 days a week open for business. I'll give you another example. One time I had an internship many, many years ago for a magazine called Ultra, Ultra. They were in Manhattan, New York City, over in the publishing district, which was sort of Third Avenue-ish. If you ever saw the film The Devil Wears Prada, that kind of environment, but very 1980s. Okay. So I just want to give you a reference. And I remember in the magazine world, it was such a big deal to have a monthly magazine, that the issue would come out monthly. It would usually come out a week before the beginning of a new month. And it really set the tone for fashion. It set the tone for articles about entertainment, recipes, foods, places to go, places to vacation. And people really did look forward to getting the magazines. Either they went, again, very social, foot traffic to go buy the magazine. You would see people in the street, you'd see people at the newsstand. You would talk about the magazine. You would stand in line to buy the magazine, see people in the line, same as a movie theater, and then spend maybe 2 days combing the magazine from page to page. Today, we don't have to do that. You can get all this media online. We don't even need to have the paper activity. We don't need the foot traffic. We can seem to get almost anything, available to us. Streaming services. We can see videos, we can see designers. We have different relationship. We can go right to the designer, see what they have in their videos for fast fashion. We don't even need to buy the magazine. So you see, so much of how we get information has truly changed. It really has become not only a science, it has not only become a informative methodology, but it has really become truly an art form, how it is. I remember being young, I'll give you another example, being young, and if you even want to look it up, you could look it up because you have that ability. You could look up what Times Square used to look like in the 1960s. I was born 1963, and Times Square sort of had a seedy kind of landscape. It really wasn't a place where people hung out when I was growing up whatsoever. In the 1970s, it had a lot of prostitution, what we call today human trafficking, sex for sale, etc. 1980s had a lot of drugs, a lot of pornography, a lot of sex for sale, a lot of X-rated theaters, live sex acts. I mean, you name it, you could find it. And somewhere around 1990s, they started to clean it up. And it clearly, when I was growing up, looked nothing like it did today. I mean, on Times Square, they have all this media all over the place. You can get the news standing in Times Square. You can watch videos standing, on all these very, very big screens. It just goes to show you the evolution of even geography and urban landscape and the news. how it's readily available for us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All this advertisement, all this information. I think to myself in pop culture, I ask this question to my husband, I ask this question to people close to me, because that's who I have to talk to all day. I ask people, I say, do you think we're overloaded with media? Now, I don't ask too many people your generation because you really don't know the difference. This is how you grew up. You're like my youngest child, Sergey. He's going to be 18 in May. He doesn't know any different. He knows how to do all these marvelous things, get all this information. We can shop J.C. Penney's in the middle of the night, Bloomingdale's, Old Navy, 3 o'clock in the morning. He and I can go through shopping sites. Here's an example. Sergey and I can be in two different places on the phone and at the same time look at different things we can buy on the internet, have it brought to the home so that there's no foot traffic, and he and I can be in two different locations talking about sweatshirts and hoodies. When my daughter, who's closer to 40 than to 30, when she was a teenager, we didn't have that. I'd have to say, Tabitha, when did you want to go to the mall? We'd have to get in the car, make small talk. You remember those days with your mother, make small talk in the car. Then we'd have to go to the mall. Then, of course, I couldn't make like I knew her in the mall. You know how it is, 15, 16. Then she'd have to see all her friends in the mall. Then they'd have to compare what they were all buying in the mall. And I would have to like have whole hours in this contained mall, you know, making like I didn't know my daughter, but I was very handy to pay all the bills. And then all of the mothers would see one another. We were all sort of relegated over to the pretzel place with the cheese on the pretzel. And we would sit there and we would all exchange ideas and compare notes about the kids, you see. And that was pop culture. That was just the construct of everyday life. We didn't think it would ever change. I never thought it would change. I never thought it would be different. Today, the mall here in Rochester looks like a ghost town. Now, Marketplace, which is near RIT, it's now taken over. It's such a beautiful facility by U of R, University of Rochester. They do some light surgical things there. They do PT, OT. They have all kinds of interventions, all kinds of things over there, X-ray, CAT scan. That was a mall. It's so hard to believe. And there was like 416 stores, retail spaces. And the food court was such that, you really had to sort of secure a table, whether you were hungry or not. Because if you waited and you bought food, who knew if you were going to get a table to sit and eat your food? And that's how life was. And today we just really don't even have these malls because, again, sort of like the newspaper, we don't have to have the foot traffic. We don't have to go get it. But yet the news and the shopping and the films, to me, in my mind, I'm going to go to another subject in a minute. To me, in my mind, it's all the same thing because I can do this all hours of the night. I don't have to wonder to myself online, is Old Navy open? I just log on. For me, it's always open. I remember when the internet, this is sort of funny. I remember what year could this have been? Maybe 2009-ish, 2010, so quite a while ago, right? In the middle of the night, somewhere around 11 o'clock at night, to me today, that's the middle of the night, 11 o'clock at night, the refrigerator broke. My husband came upstairs. He said, Jen, the refrigerator broke. He said, it's an older refrigerator. It's not worth repairing. What should we do? I said, well, I'm going to buy another refrigerator. And I remember he said, well, when do you want to go to the Lowe's or the Home Depot or the Sears? I said, I'm going to buy it online. He said, you're going, it's sort of funny. He said, you're going to buy the refrigerator online. I said, oh yeah, I'm gonna get on the internet. This is what I said. I'm gonna get on the internet. I'm gonna look at the refrigerators. I'm gonna click pay, and somebody's gonna bring it here tomorrow. He said, don't you want to see them first? At the time I was in my 40s, maybe 50. I said, I've seen like thousands of refrigerators in my life. I already know what they look like. I know what they do. I see the picture. I'm sure if for some reason I have some aversion to it, they'll take it back. I'll buy another one. And that's how I bought the refrigerator. I did click, 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 got the credit card out, and I never stepped foot in the store once. I just bought it and it came. And that was the end of the story. Years ago, to buy a refrigerator, it would have required foot traffic. I would have had to have gone, go get it, etc. I think about DoorDash. I've never DoorDashed my whole life, but I think about all these food services, right? Where you can eat practically anything you would like, providing they sell it in your region, and somebody else goes and gets it. Of course, you pay, and then they come and bring it to your door. You never have to see them either. You can do all these transactions online, sort of like getting the news, right? And never even know who brought you your food and wrap it up, right? And then they ring the bell or you watch them from this ring cam. You see, it's just so interesting to me because if somebody said to me 20 years ago, this is going to be how people get groceries, this is going, I know people who haven't stepped in a grocery store in nearly a decade. I mean, I can't picture that. I go to the grocery store maybe three, four, five times a week. I don't buy a lot all at once. We buy a few things every time we go because it's sociable. You understand? Like we like to get dressed, we like to see the weather, we like to get in the car. Sergey likes to go. We go to the little cafe section where they have the rotisserie chicken. They have the deli meat. Sometimes he gets us up. You see, it's sociable. I say hi to people. I live in Chilai, which isn't far from RIT. I see many RIT people. And then we park once, you see. Then we walk over to the Target. We shop there, lots of foot traffic for Sergey and I. We get our steps. So it's very nice for me. But a lot of people, they don't relate to what I'm saying. Even in the town that I live, even people my age, they say, you go to the store. It's like I might as well tell them I went, to a cave for the day. They're like, oh, I would never do that. I would never go to the store. I'm like, how do you get groceries? Well, I just click, sort of like me with the refrigerator. They're like, and then I set the time, and I can even do the grocery shopping 10 o'clock at night from the living room, and then it comes the next day when I say it's going to come. I said, I just don't see myself doing it. Isn't it interesting? In contemporary pop culture, on one hand, I love to get the news, different hours of the day, right? The shopping for the refrigerator, the clothing I don't care much about. We buy most of it online, so I don't care about that either. But for some reason, I still like to go get my food, and I do like to go to let's say, the pharmacy and get prescriptions or over the counter health and beauty aids, over the counter, elixirs, tonics, drugs, etc. I do that in person. So, so it's just so interesting to me that there are some people, a variety of ages, that have completely given up the whole notion of foot traffic or sitting in a congregate setting to get news. Here's another one, to get a phone call, right? Used to be when I was growing up, clearly into my 20s, we didn't have cell phones. We really didn't have cell phones till I was in my mid 30s. I mean, if you were waiting for a phone call, it meant, I know this really sounds untrue, but it is. It meant you sat in your living room or wherever the phone was with a cord stuck into the wall. You waited and you waited until the phone rang, you got your phone call, and then you went about your business. But you certainly weren't, say, at the library, you weren't at the mall, you weren't at all these other places while you're waiting for a phone call. So that obviously I enjoy contemporary culture, pop culture. It stayed with me. I go all kinds of places and take phone calls. I don't sit waiting for a phone call. Just like I can tape these little round table discussions at any time, day and night, doesn't matter to me, and it doesn't matter to you because on your end, you get to watch it whenever you'd like. Sort of like how we receive news today. You just click when you're ready and you get everything that you need to have. So those are my thoughts on how things used to be so different. And maybe everybody goes through this. You know, maybe in the 1800s, people, in order to get news, they went to community bulletin boards. Maybe they went to community coffee hours. Maybe that was the purpose of so much religion. Regardless of the religion, people went to these congregate settings to get information, whether it was church or maybe to a market or maybe to a swap meet. And so we relied on a lot of foot traffic because we didn't have all this ability to get information anytime, any day, during any hour, 7 days a week. Nobody cares what the weather is. Anything is possible. Maybe late 1800s, early 1900s, one of the functions of going to work was to get the news. Here's a phrase. I don't know if you know this phrase. I don't even know if it's part of pop culture or contemporary culture anymore. People say, oh, water cooler talk. So what that meant is that you didn't have water bottles like we do today. You went to the water cooler at work, right? That meant you didn't work at home. You went to the water cooler and people would go get a sip or two of water out of a paper cup that you couldn't put down, by the way. It had like a point at the end of it. You see it in classic vintage television, and people would have small talk over by the water cooler, or they'd go over to the copier, right? The Xerox copier. And they would wait to make copies. People would talk to one another, share ideas, maybe meet somebody to go out happy hour with, go to dinner with. I know people who met their spouses over the copier or the water cooler. We don't really have that today. We become so independent of one another. People bring their own water bottle, they sit in their own cubicle. That's if they even go to work, my dears. So many people are working from home still, and they take care of their needs. Can you imagine you can go the whole day probably to work and not have to really interact with many people at all? You bring your own water, you have your own phone, you can get all of your own information. You can have a little personal printer. That's if you're even dealing in paper. I mean, you can send files to other people who needs a copy anymore. I don't know the last time I even made a copy. I'm sitting here thinking to myself, it must be years, years ago, because we can scan things, take pictures of things. So we can just be so independent of one another that we don't even see people to exchange information. Or if we do, we can text them or we can just send a file. And it's so self-explanatory, we don't even need to have any kind of words to introduce the file. We just send it and say nothing. So I think to myself, what would happen if we traded all of this for the way it used to be, how I remember it when I was in college, where if you wanted a copy of something, you had to make a copy, you had to hand it to somebody. I like the way things are today in contemporary culture where I can be so independent and not rely on so many of these other aspects of being around to get news, being, available, being at a place at a certain time to access information. But at the same time, I'll tell you what I miss. I really miss people. I miss seeing long lines, people shopping. I miss seeing people around holidays in stores where they go. You see people, range of emotion. You see sad people, happy people. You see stressed people. I remember times at malls where I would see like whole hordes of people from different towns. I would always see somebody I knew. So it was sort of nice. You would catch up on things. It was wonderful in so many ways. And I have to say, I do miss that. I do miss seeing people. Now I see people when I drive. I see the Amazon truck come, the UPS truck, and I see the trucks, but the people that used to come out of the house to go do all these kinds of accessing information, accessing goods, consumables, they're still in the house. So that's where I'll leave off with you this evening. We might touch upon this subject again as it relates to fashion, food, more topics, but certainly I wanted us again to think about how it is that we access news, how it is that we access information, things that seem to be so important. We have a variety of methods in which to get this information all night, all day. And I think it does change the way we see ourselves, the way we see things that are important to us. I think it has changed us. So I'll leave you with that idea, this notion. How much do you rely on your phone? Like when you wake up in the morning to see the news, to check for texts, to check for emails from school. How reliant are you? What would happen if we had a whole media blackout, or if we had, for some reason, some aspect of infrastructure? It sounds very it sounds cryptic, but I don't mean it to be. But if the whole thing went away and we had to revert back to the days when we had to rely on congregate settings or more traditional methods, vintage methods, in getting our information, would you be prepared, right? My generation has had to spend a great deal of lifetime learning all these new technologies that people learn today at 3 and 4 years old. So can you imagine if it was reversed? Can you imagine if somebody said to you, gee, you have to wait for the phone call and you have to wait near the phone so you hear the phone because the phone isn't portable either. It's on a cord stuck into the wall. Can you imagine if you had to change your life back to those times and methods? Could you really do it? That's the question. Could you really reverse contemporary construct, contemporary culture? What would your pop culture look like that I call vintage? So you have a nice evening. Don't worry, it's not going to happen. Don't freak out. It's not going to happen. All the technology is here to stay, but to put yourself in a situation where what would happen if it went away or if it was modified? How would it feel to you if that was the new pop culture? There you go. There you go. That was my question tonight. Well, you have a good evening and be blessed always. I hope you're enjoying break. By now you're off break, but you're in my thoughts. Have a nice evening. So we'll call this one that was so 5 minutes ago. Can you imagine if that was their pop culture, if they lost everything?
Hmm.
They'd freak, wouldn't they?
Yes.